Hi everybody, how are you doing? I'm just gonna give everyone a minute to log in, okay? Got 10 people so far, looking really good. All right, I think everyone's on. There we go. I am Jackie from Hub City, and I'm here with Charles Dodd White and Karen Salyer McElmurray. We're so happy to have both of them, and they're amazing books. We do have copies of How Fire Runs in stock, and Wanting Radiance is on the way, so it will both be signed by the authors. I'm just going to give a little bit of a background for these two authors today, and then they have some questions ready for each other. And if you have questions, if you'll just put them in the chat window for us so that we don't interrupt their conversation, and I will voice those for us towards the end of the meeting. So Charles Dodd White is the author of 4 novels, including 2 from Swallow Press. This one, How Fire Runs, and In the House of Wilderness. He has received the Appalachian Book of the Year Award and the Chaffin Award for his fiction. He lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he is an associate professor of English at Pellissippi State Community College. Karen Salyer McElmurray won an AWP Award for creative nonfiction for her book Surrendered Child, A Birth Mother's Journey, and the Horizon Award for creative nonfiction for her essay Blue Glass. She has had other essays recognized as notable essays in Best American Essays, while her essays Speaking Freely and Addicts were nominated for Pushcart Awards. She currently teaches at Gettysburg College and in West Virginia, Wesleyan's Low Residency MFA program. Thank you so much for joining us, Charles and Karen, and I'm going to turn it over for you guys, okay?
Well, hello everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. I wanted to start out first this evening, and because I'm just so eager to sit back and listen to some of my favorite writing from Charles's book. My own book, Wanting Radiance, which it's been out a while now, it came out in April, right in the midst of the pandemic. So that was a really fun and challenging time to have a book come out. But it's a book that was in the works for quite a long time. It first started we were just talking about Asheville. This book first started in a trailer outside of Weaverville, North Carolina. I was in a deeply heartbroken state at that time, and a friend advised that I go to see a fortune teller. So I went to this woman's trailer. She lived in a trailer behind the Ingalls. And what she did was read shadows in photographs. So that was one of the starts of this book. And then another start of it was many years before that, when I was a kid, really. And all the time I would spend visiting my great aunt Deli, who owned a small diner with a garage in back of it. It was called the Black Cat in Allen, Kentucky. And then I think in the biggest way this book is started with and is about my many road trips over the years and my many moves. I've sort of a person for a long time not knowing where home was, and I've moved as many as 40 times. Now, putting all that together, I think this book is about kind of like who's seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Can I see a hand there? Who's seen, I'm calling this Oh Sister, Where Art Thou? It's a woman's road trip to find out who she is before she can love anyone. The book includes tarot cards, ghosts, a freak museum that I imagined in Knoxville, Tennessee, and it's called Willie's Wonderama. And I'm going to read you, to get us started tonight, just a couple of pages from the novel. And here you will meet the central character, whose name is Maricel Loving. She's a 30-something roadie who travels and makes just enough to get by telling false fortunes. So far in her life, the things that she knows most definitely about herself are these. When she was 15, her mother, who was a teller of true fortunes, was shot by someone who has remained unknown. The other thing that Maricel thinks she knows is that the shooter was her own father. And above all, she's haunted by not knowing who at all her father is. In this scene, Maricel has just spent the night also in a trailer, belonging to the man she meets as her grandfather. And she's been spent the night hunting through things and things that belong to her mother. And her mother's name is Ruby Loving. You'll hear that name in these 2 pages. But she's hunting through things and things that belonged to Ruby when she was a girl. And after that night of hunting, she's sitting outside under a full moon. So just a couple of pages. All the chapters are titled, and this one is called Night and Then. Outside now, I shivered against the night sounds. An owl or some other critter calling out. Owls and whippoorwills were about the only bird names I knew. I spoke other names aloud to fend off the dark. States, capitals, kinds of coal, anthracite, bituminous, slack, the coal Ruby said they picked up beside the road to get them through a winter, types of clouds, cumulus, cirrus. And I thought of Ruby standing, pointing at the afternoon sky. No 2 clouds are alike, Miracell, she'd say. Above me, a full moon. So many names for the moon, too. Old man face, rabbit, sliver of moon. I raised my head to the dark of the late summer sky and screamed, loud enough my throat went raw. Ruby Loving, Ruby, you here now? No tickle in my hair, no voice in my ear. I was Ruby empty. I took a long drink of the warm ditch water tasting beer, then asked myself what I'd do next. I reached into my pack for a cigarette and instead felt the muzzle of her gun, Ruby's gun. A lady's derringer, she'd called it. Then she'd laugh at herself. I took the gun out, laid it in the lap my crossed knees made. The barrel gleamed in the moonlight. Seashell, sea dream. I could hear Ruby counting the way she'd loved the derringer for its abalone. What had I wished for then? I remembered little about wishing. I remembered road signs and towns with names like Leote, Harmony, Bliss, names that could have been women, all of them hoping for as much as Ruby had hoped once upon a time. And for what? What had either of us hoped for, my mother and me, that had ever come true? I felt in my pocket and took them out, the 3 bullets I'd pocketed in the trailer, and counted myself lucky they slid as easy as oil to the chambers. It was meant to be, I thought, and I spun the loaded cylinder, clicked it back in, aimed at nothing, aimed at the shadows of tree branches, aimed at the moon itself, its moist white eye. It was almost funny how I'd traveled with a loaded gun, but I fired it only now and only once. The shot rang in my ears, breaking the night stillness. I didn't fire again, though it felt incomplete not to. Nothing could ever make the sound the night my mother died. That shot rang out, and boots from some man I never saw thudded at a door, and I held my mother in my arms as she died. I must have slept because I dreamed, first of hands, Cody Black's and the tattoos on his fingers, Ruby's fortune-telling hands, and later, when she bled out in my arms, her palms as see-through as melting wax. Hands held other hands in my sleep. Some shadow man's hands atop Ruby's, a father's laid atop a mother's, mine in the mix, hand over hand over hand, a game of it for me, a little child, hands changing to shapes on a wall, birds, horses. Later, in between sleep and memory, I dreamed her voice. Miracell, Ruby said, here. She pointed to one long line across my palm. The line broke, traveled down my wrist, across my arm, became a seam. Like that, I unstitched myself and dreamed myself floating out. I floated over the earth, this earth, before it was a flat, dry place of nothing at all. There was a mountain then, a dream of a mountain, dark green, ripe. I was that mountain, green and alive. I was that dreamed mountain when the world blew apart, layer upon layer of mountain exploding until nothing was left but a blank earth. And beneath that, a black hole, an opening heading down. In that hole beneath the earth, there were men, all the men I had desired, all the men who had wanted me and not wanted me, all their faces one dreamed face, one dreamed hand pointing toward earth's heart, cold black and hard, that heart, wanting and wanting. And the man she loved was there too, the one man Ruby wanted, that man, my father. How he must have swaggered with it, his right to walk up to a door at night, his knock, and her opening herself again and again. That, my mother said in my dream, is what is at the center of everything, wanting. And now here I was, wanting him too. Thank you.
That's awesome, Karen. Can I ask you some questions now, or do you want to talk some more?
Oh, I'm just going to let you go, and then we can question each other and kind of talk together. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, one of the reasons, first of all, let everybody know that when I first asked Karen to read with me tonight, it was because I have always admired her work, and because it's such, as you can see, such evocative prose and so precise. So I do have some prepared questions that I wanted to ask you. I don't know which of these I should. I'll probably start with one I was going to actually ask first, which was that I have that your writing is often so descriptive and poetic. And I know that different writers approach this differently, but is that something that you deliberately bring to your work? We were talking a little bit about this, I think, before we started today, about like how we set out to write something versus the way it actually turns out. But is that something you deliberately impose, that lyricism, or is that something that you kind of hammer away to finish as you go back and get to that stage? And kind of as you can consider it a follow-up or kind of relatedly, how do you see that interplay between lyrical writing and the content, which is often content that is not what we would expect to see with lyricism, but rather what used to be called the rough South. I don't know if we call it that anymore, but.
So you're saying that lyric writing wouldn't be seen typically with like Harry Crews or yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just like, but it's you have he has a harder edge for sure than your books, I think, which are more in tune with the beautiful and the rare.
Well, you know, is it something I plan to do? Not at this point. I think that as far back as I can remember, and I was 12 years old, and I came from a pretty difficult home. And I would spend summers with my granny in Hager Hill in Eastern Kentucky. And I got to know a girl then, Vicki Hayes, who's still one of my best friends all these years later. And she played a 12-string guitar and wrote poems. And it was like listening to her and reading those poems. I found a place with my hands and a blank page that could speak the difficulty that I came from with my mother, especially. My mother suffered from mental illness, and there was not a way to have a voice in that house. So listening to those poems and listening to Vicki play the 12-string, I found a way to give voice to my experience. Did I know it at 12 years old? No. But that was as far back as I can remember. That's the way I wrote and the way I heard words. I don't know if I plan it now. It's the way, I think my writing is pretty dang dark. I don't know if, I would say it's certainly not like Harry Crews, I just mentioned, but it is dark work. But I believe strongly that the lyric voice, the beauty of image can translate the darkness I experienced, much as I translated it when I was 12 years old. You said that the language is concise. Man, I wish it were concise. even as I'm reading from this book, I'm still paring down the words. I'm thinking, not that word, or put that word up there. So it's an ongoing process for me. I think that the next time I write a book, I'm going to do what a friend of mine did, is read the whole thing aloud, you know, chapter by chapter, a few pages at a time, and make it more concise. I think concise, I wish for concise, and it's getting there. I don't know, it's getting there.
Do you write poetry as well? I mean, that maybe this is me not doing my homework, but I don't remember seeing your poetry. But I mean, is that something you practice?
I have not. I wrote only poetry until I was about, say, 23, 24. Originally, I was going to, I studied at the University of Virginia, and I went there, was going to be a scholar, and studied D.H. Lawrence. And I kind of hated academia and being a scholar. So I set out for a while, and I was going to go into the MFA program in poetry. And they read my manuscript and said, you know, your poems are so narrative. Maybe you want to go into fiction here. So I went into fiction. But I haven't written poems since that time. What I do now, though, I write lyric essays. You know, there's sometimes in little fragments that one fragment fits next to another fragment, and they can move via image or sound even. So they're of like poems, but I haven't written poems in a long time. I'm fearful of them. I don't feel like I know the language of poems, like the poetics, enough to do them justice.
Don't you find, though, the essay is just such a beautiful meditative form, with whether you write it lyrically or narratively or some combination of the two, that it seems like the kind of the purest form of writing that I've ever encountered. I don't know if that's something that you feel as well, but it just seems so liberating.
The essay?
Yeah, the essay.
It's definitely liberating for me. As a fiction writer, what I love to do, or what happens for me naturally, is to lose myself in the sound, to lose myself in the language, and I backpedal against plot. When it comes to the essay, it is a kind of a pure experience. It can, you know, the plot of the essay can be about how one sound rubs up against another, how one image like kind of gives birth to another image or another moment. And it is, I like that it's a pure experience.
Yeah, I read, I guess it was in the spring, Sarah Baker's book about Montaigne, How to Live, and just, I don't know if you've read that or not, but I highly recommend it for everybody listening, because it's such a beautiful.
Sarah Baker?
Sarah Baker, right? Just this beautiful take on Montaigne and how really understanding him from just a kind of a practical way that I find fascinating. But yeah, I agree that the essay is, I think it's really the writer's form, you know, in terms of people that really pay attention to the way that sentences spill out on the page. It's fascinating to me. I'm getting a little off topic, I realize, but it's interesting, I think, to talk about that, because especially I think of you very much as a stylist, and it's certainly something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my own work and other writers as well.
I was going to say that you asked about poetry, which I don't do, but I think that poetry, or at least this poetic voice, is wed to the essay more naturally for me than its union with fiction. And that's a harder call for me. It's much more labor intensive. It takes me a long time.
With fiction, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, essays are a pleasure, whereas fiction is just work, you know. I mean, that's the way it feels to me, at least. I know some people probably love it, but yeah, it feels like you're clocking in when you're working on a fiction piece.
Well, that'd be asking you a question. Is that okay?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course.
So you talk about the work of fiction. I guess, you know, somewhere in my head, you know, I'm not getting any younger, but I've still got these two books in my head, one a novel. I've never started out with a novel, plotting it, graphing it on pieces of paper, you know, and walking around the room and putting the pages up on the wall. Do you do that? Do you have the whole thing plotted before you begin?
No, I don't. I couldn't do that. That's like solving a murder or something. I'm just not, that's not my style. But I see Kelsey's laughing about that. But it's yeah, no, that would take a lot of the pleasure that I do get out of it if I had to do that. I do have a pretty good idea of the structure ahead of time, but it's all something that I just hold in my head. I don't necessarily sketch it out because I think it kind of goes against the one of the things that you always want to try to have in a good book, which is surprise. And I think if you over design a book, that you can absolutely make it wooden if you're not careful. And so I have resisted that. But I mean, I use a very typically basic structure, which is a collision course narrative. So it's for me fairly easy to keep that in mind. I don't have multiple timelines like you do in this book, for example. Like I find that it would have been a lot harder to keep everything straight if I were dealing with multiple timelines that in the ways in which that balance out. But
it'd be easier for me to live my life if I didn't think that way.
Did you put your stuff up on the wall, or did you do that, or?
I first with this book tried really hard. Years ago, I worked for the MFA program at Warren Wilson College, and I got to sit in on some workshops taught by Robert Boswell. I wasn't really part of the program. I just worked in the office, but he suggested trying your best to sit down for, he said, 3 months and write an entire draft of a novel and then begin to shape it. I know. I tried really hard to do that. And then it just wasn't the way I think, the way I am. And so I had this thing, this shape. And it took me a long, and how I think is in layers. If I was a painter, I'd be a printmaker. I'd start with this layer and then adding this and then adding that. So that, shape thing didn't work for me very much,
Yeah, I mean, I think
I tried really hard to plot out that first draft and just go with it, but it just wasn't how I am.
Yeah, I don't either. And it seems very counterintuitive for both of us, just the way that we write. I can just reading our books, I think you probably get a sense that we don't do that kind of hard dump of text and then revise. I'm sure we've never talked about this, but I suspect you may be a fan of Graham Greene. I mean, I am at least. Yes. And he has that very measured approach to the novel. And his kind of limitation was that 500 words a day. That was the kind of the capstone, or that was the cutoff limit. And I find that to me to be very manageable and also really more effective as a writer. Like I can do 500 words a day, and if I cut myself off that, it's usually a pretty good 500 words. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't need this kind of major overhaul. Whereas if I were to push beyond that, I think that it'd be such a law of diminishing returns. You would be faced with just so many problems that you start to stray into different aspects of the psychology of what you're fiddling with. But anyhow, I do have one last. Let me ask you one more question. I'm sorry, I'm very free ranging here. This is the one that I was going to talk about, was just the idea of influence, but I will influence with a twist, because I know that's a question that kind of gets asked a lot. But like, this is something I'm always interested in, because maybe it's something I experienced. But one, were there any kind of writers that were at your ear as you were writing this, like that were kind of like bending that ear and saying, this is something, and I suspect that I might know one of them specifically, but but I'm just curious, is that something that you feel that ebbs and flow over time? Like, do you have certain writers who maybe commanded your interest in a more direct way when you were writing your earlier books versus now? Is that something that kind of changes over time for you, or do you have certain touchstones that just kind of remain that way throughout?
I think that I have certain touchstones that I come back to again and again. I mean, some of my favorite writers have long been Virginia Woolf, James Agee.
That's the one I thought. That's who I was thinking of specifically, but yeah.
James Agee.
Yeah.
I mean, he's absolutely one of my favorite writers. I mean, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is something I come back to again and again. And A Death in the Family. So, there are touchstones. I mean, William Faulkner is one of my favorite writers.
That was another one, yeah.
Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of my favorite writers. There's touchstones. But in terms of reading while I'm working, sometimes it's a hard way to go for me. When I was working on this novel, it would be hard for me to pick up another novel and read, because then I would come the next morning after reading that afternoon to the page, and my voice would start to echo what I just read. So while I'm reading fiction, I have much more of a tendency to read nonfiction.
Yeah.
Or I certainly always and forever have the tendency to start a writing day with reading poetry, and reading poetry aloud, And also, I wish I knew how to take pictures and take them really, really well. I don't have a camera, but I go out and walk every day now and take pictures when I'm walking with this phone, I'm hooked to. And there's something about taking those pictures of light. I see writing as taking a picture of light or translating light. So I would say that would be a touchstone. I might not have answered your question.
No.
I might have forgotten what it was.
That's what happens.
Do I get to hear you read something?
Yeah, I guess I'll read a little bit here, and then we'll turn the tables, I suppose. But first, this is Karen's excellent book, Wanting Radiance, which
thank you, Charles.
Hub City will have in shortly. So I'll just read the opening of mine. This book is How Fire Runs, came out in October. It was my first stab at political fiction, I suppose, but political fiction in a small town, kind of trying to look at how those big national issues kind of really resonate on a small scale, because I think that that's where the capacity for change comes from, is locally. And I actually have I'll actually read one of the epigrams, which is from Wendell Berry, which I felt was kind of the organizing idea behind the book, which was that the mentality that destroys a watershed and then panics at the threat of flood is the same mentality that gives institutionalized insult to Black people and then panics at the prospect of race riots. And I picked that because it, I think, unifies this idea essentially that how we treat the world, the earth, is inextricably related to how we treat each other. So that was the idea behind it. I started the book shortly after Charlottesville, and then we saw it, of course, that everybody knows what I'm talking about, but Charlottesville, the white right, alt-right protest there, and the way that I saw that, it's such a harbinger of what I was afraid the Trump presidency would be, and what it ended up being, obviously culminating in the January 6th insurrection. But so that I was writing about what was concerning to me, which was that I see that we essentially have a proto-fascist movement in this country, that even though the proto-fascist leader is gone, I think that the proto-fascist movement is still quite alive and well. And so I wanted to write about the ways in which things that we think are unmentionable are actually quite possible. So that's why I wrote the book and tried to show what a small community in East Tennessee would be like if they were faced with this possibility in very direct terms. So I'll just read the opening. There's a little short prologue, but then this is the opening of the book. Kyle Pettis watched the slant of light for a sense of changed time. Winter had been a trial for much of what he grew, but he had made adjustments in accordance with the sun, and now the season was coming back around. He shifted the cabbages to the rear of the greenhouse, pushed the amaryllis and larkspur to the edge of the wooden crib, pinched the petals of his primroses as he would tender fingertips. They were doing well. They were healthy. He turned on the garden hose and filled the big watering can. The stream played in the metal bottom until the water line came up a few inches. The rest of the way it filled with the sound, like a kind voice. He heard Orlin's Jeep grind up from the base of the cove long before she swung around the curve at the bottom of the mountain and chugged up the rest of the way. She drove on around to the side next to the tool shed and killed the engine. He saw that she wore her heavy coat, though it was only a cool 40 degrees that morning. Permanently cold-blooded, she'd once told him. As a timber rattler, he'd said once, and she'd laughed, and it had been their unspoken joke since then. Hey, kid, she called, held up a paper bag with damp swatches of grease. I took care of biscuits for us. I'll only charge a 10% delivery fee. Take it on up to the house. I'll water this row and see you up there in a minute. Though Kyle gave her a good 5 minutes to make it up from the greenhouses, he overtook her short of the front porch. She'd had to rest at the top of the wooden hillside she'd had to rest at the top of the wooden steps embedded in the hillside. Hip going bad, 85 at the end of the month. And still she insisted on coming out to work with him, just as she had his mother and father since they had bought the property 52 years before. All his life, Orlin had been out here, nursing the greenery that would supply other people's gardens. He had thought of telling her to sell the camper she kept on the Doe River, to come up and stay in the spare bedroom of the main house, but he knew she would have refused. She wanted no charity, only the promise of work and to help things grow. You go on up. I'll be there in a minute, she told him. I'm just testing gravity, making sure the earth is still willing to grab hold of me. All right. You want a coffee, don't you? Does the Pope crap in the woods? I don't know. I'll ask a Catholic grizzly bear. He went up and ground some fresh beans, poured some well water into the back of the Mr. Coffee, and watched it wheeze and spit into the carafe. By the time it had filled, Orlean had made it to the front door, put her rear in the big Queen Anne chair in the front room next to the wood-burning stove. She didn't bother unbuttoning her parka, though her forehead was already slick with sweat. He handed over her coffee. It wasn't difficult to see that some mornings were harder on her than others. Clear to him that the only thing worse than dragging herself out of bed to a full day working amid the rows was the prospect of doing nothing at all. She was about as tough as anyone he'd ever known. So he wouldn't ever tell her what she couldn't do, that she needed to stay back. He couldn't imagine himself being that cruel. So that's an opening of the book there. There's that the character of Kyle Pettis is he runs a greenery nursery, and he has a reforestation project, which is part of this connection to the land it's a big part of the book. And there's also, and it comes back several times, for you guys that have read Voltaire's Candide, I think one of my probably favorite conclusions to any novel that I've ever read is, how do you basically face a world in turmoil? And it's that you cultivate your own gardens, in which that's a kind of a central theme that comes back at the very end of the book, but throughout as well. So it was that those were some of the echoes that I had kind of in my head as I was writing.
Well, one of the questions I would ask, in hearing you read, and I actually reread a good deal of the book this week, and I'm thinking about that word concise that you used in describing or asking about my work. The dialogue here is so extremely concise, so clean and clear to the ear. Could you talk about that a little bit? I mean, for me, dialogue, I hear it at the back of my brain or something, but it's like you've been out walking in the street or on the bus or at the diner, and you're listening and you're recording in your heart what you've heard. How do you come to those clean words on the page, in the spoken words?
Yeah, I think that's a really tough thing to work on. For me, good dialogue is always driving the tension of a book, right? The one of the most obvious things when you have someone who's kind of struggling with that aspect of writing a book is that they use dialogue as an exposition. And it just simply as an exposition.
Yes.
And so dialogue should never be exposition. I mean, if you can, unless there's just some overwhelming need for it. But even then, I really can't imagine the justification for that. Dialogue to me is a piece of dynamite that needs to pop off. You need dialogue in the same way that you need a jolt of electricity in your seat. And so it has to always kind of make you sit up in your chair. And so dialogue in the novel for me is not something that shouldn't even try to replicate everyday speech. Because it shouldn't try to replicate everyday speech, because if we were to write like we talk, we'd have a lot of real damn boring things to say on the page. Whereas good fiction has to always kind of draw you on to the next line. So I think that one of the big gifts, I would say that one of my favorite writers, who is James Salter, I would highly recommend to everyone, is his use of dialogue and the way that dialogue draws you down the page because you want to see the next thing that's coming. But yeah, it's just, you write great dialogue too. You know what you're doing. So it's always, I think August Wilson, he talked about when he would write a play, that the key was like when people talk, they don't answer a question. They basically speak to whatever they want to say ahead of time. So the term I use for this is crosstalk, which is that you don't, how are you doing today? You don't say, I'm doing fine. I'm like, how are you doing today? Well, day's going to hell, don't you think? I don't respond to you directly. There's a geometric angling away. And so through the course of the novel, you see these competing characters really holding forth in competing manners. So I think that's, in terms of good dialogue, that's the heart of it, because if there's anything that a writer needs to do, it needs to generate always, whether it be literary fiction or thrillers or whatever you're writing, it's got to make me want to understand more. What's the inner mystery of these two people communicating?
Have you written screenplay or drama ever? I had some thought that perhaps you had done so.
Not really. I mean, when I was in my 20s, I wrote a screenplay that never went anywhere. But yeah, no, I would love to. If you've got a contact for me, Karen, that you need to send me out to Hollywood. I'd be happy to be an advisor on a Southern show if you've got.
At the same time that I am responding to the dialogue is this crisp, clear, clean thing in this novel. And I like what you're saying about how one line of dialogue, one speaker leads to the next thing. It moves the plot along, it moves the work along. There are other parts of this novel, and as I was reading again this week, I marked a bunch of them. It's like the language takes on some other level of diction, some other sort of mythic primal quality. And just a couple examples, one from that great prologue that's in italics, just this line, he beholds it all now and smiles. And then move it over on page 16. I just love marking these things because I love the language so much. Let's see, the sentence is, I'm just going to move further in it. Tearing themselves apart in northern cities like scavengers, ripping apart the flanks of some great dying beast. I mean, there the language enters some other realm that it's not about that precision of the dialogue. It becomes, and the best I could describe it was thinking of it as mythic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely admire that kind of writing as well.
Do you like Cormac McCarthy?
Sure, yeah, for sure. He was certainly one of my big. I mean, it's a weird kind of cross pollination, but I would say the two big ones are Cormac McCarthy and James Salter, which are very antipodal. They're very antipodal writers. But yeah, I mean, I think that those moments are powerful. They can be certainly very powerful. I think it's one of those things that I think the older, and it's maybe the reason I asked you this question as well, is like it's one of those influences that I feel that recedes over time. Like if Faulkner is also, I came to Faulkner long before I came to McCarthy, like a long time. And he does that same kind of thing, you know, and but with less precision. I would say that McCarthy has a kind of Hemingwayan precision, like kind of infused that Faulkner doesn't have, but they still both have that mythic voice that you're talking about. But it's one of those things that I find that I'm less interested in the more I write. I feel that it can be at times a little bit of a camouflage. And I'm not saying that I was camouflaging anything specifically in that moment when I was writing it, but I'm more interested in the precise writing as I get older. And it seems to be, I think, a pretty common trajectory for people that start out stylistically extravagant, I guess is a way to say it, you know. But
that really interests me. Say more about that. I mean, starting out stylistic and then moving forward to something, are you like plainer, simpler, cleaner?
Yeah, I mean, I think it forces you into the story. All right. I mean, you know, one of the books that I teach my students is really the perfect example of fiction writing is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. And that is such I mean, obviously we're reading it in translation, but you can tell it's a very plain written book. You know, it's very obvious, as opposed to Dostoevsky's books, which are, you can tell, are completely congested messes, despite their power. They're just, they're obviously stylistic messes. And as a sidebar, my favorite comment about Theodore Dreiser ever was when Hemingway said, when reading Theodore Dreiser, he felt like he was reading a powerful Russian novel in a terribly inadequate translation, which I think encapsulates Theodore Dreiser better than anything that I've ever heard. Yeah, I think that the deeper that you get into things, the more that those sorts of pyrotechnics, the stylistic pyrotechnics, have less persuasive value to me personally, at least.
I just have to say, in this book, and especially I felt it in Wilderness, it was just that mythic presence. It was so resonant for me when I would find those moments. And then we would move on from that, sort of like you said about the dialogue, and then we'd move on to the next. Yeah. I would move on to the next. I'd move on cleanly and clearly, like flowing on water. And then I would come to one of those moments that I would just be completely blown away. So I'm quite fond of it in your work.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I'll ever be able to exercise that impulse completely from my writing.
Please don't.
You know, but it's one of those things that I do feel that it's better to tamp it down. You know what I mean? As we go forward, at least for me. I mean, everybody's different, but it does seem to be one of those things.
Well, here's a whole different kind of question. I'm not sure what you'll think of it. We were talking about the rough South earlier, and do you know that documentary, Gary Hawkins, The Rough South of Harry Crews?
I've seen that one and the Larry Brown one both.
Yeah, I've seen both of them. I've seen that Harry Crews one. I must have seen it a dozen times. I'm just obsessed with it. But I like how it's put together like an essay, a fragmented essay, and there's those titles. And one section of it, I think, is the violence that finds us. I think it's interesting that you and I are having this conversation. I think we both write about violence, but I write about it in a much more emotional violence, perhaps, generational violence, something like that. But both of your novels are about violence, social, physical. Could you talk about that, the violence that has found you in these two books?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I don't want it to ever be the primary engine of a book. I want it to be incidental to the situation or the characters.
But there's such redemption and, so anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. I'm glad you think there's redemption. I tried for there to be redemption in that.
Big time.
For both of these last two books, honestly, even Wilderness, I think, has quite a bit of redemption to it. But it was funny to come from such a book that is I thought was a domestic kind of personalized book, like In the House of Wilderness, and then kind of step out and try to do this very big kind of the moment book. But I think the violence in both of them both come from moments of desperation, and how can they essentially find some salvation? And for me, they were never meant to be pornographic in nature, in the sense that they were supposed to be the point of the book, but rather that they were getting you to understand how this is what happens when this kind of pressure cooker is applied. And in the case of How Fire Runs, the pressure cooker is social, it's historical, it's cultural, and those are all things that you impose on a character to see what the ultimate kind of proof of who they are is. And Joyce Carol Oates this week on Twitter actually put something up that she's got a good Twitter feed. Usually she can often irritate people, but she had a good point where she was talking about classical philosophy and the difference of classical philosophy of the human, and that idea of what classical philosophers would present the human as this brain in a bottle, essentially, and why she thinks that the novel is such a superior form, because it locates us in the everyday, that it takes all these grand, large scale ideas and puts them into human skin. And I think that that's ultimately what any kind of novel that engages with the political should strive to do. And it's certainly what I was trying to do. And it was a book that isn't trying to speak for any one person, but rather to try to provide a dialogue for how we see the world today. The literary critic Bakhtin, he talks about the Russian novel particularly as a dialogic, as a dialogue. And I think that that's one of the best ways to think about political writing, is that it's a dialogue between one point and one counterpoint and another counterpoint and a refutation and another point, so those are all kind of things that were kind of going around my head. And certainly violence, though, is still a very human response to all those big ideas. So
no, that's why I like
again,
that.
incidental.
That phrase from that document, from the Gary Hawkins documentary, the violence that finds us. It finds these characters. And then how do they respond? What do they do with that situation? Are they drowned by it, or do they find redemption? Do they rise to the light and breathe? That's why I like these books so much. Jackie, do we need to ask what? I just wanted to ask you where we are in time, because I have all these questions I could ask, and I'm loving this conversation so much.
The conversation has been delightful. Thank you both so much for reading and having such great questions for each other. We don't have any questions in the from the audience so far. Just oh, there's one popping up. Just mostly some wonderful commentary on your reading and some comments on the book. So I'll save those for later and send them to you guys if you like. Dr. McConnell asks, let me hit the, hold on a second. There we go. I've been lucky enough to hear both writers read before, Karen as long ago as the 90s at Georgia and Charles at the Festival in Union. And even if I hadn't heard their voices, I and we all would know they're deeply Southern. So I'm curious about you both. If you weren't Southerners, would you still be writers?
Wow.
And you can answer that one first, Karen.
Oh, that's just what I was going to say, Charles. Wow, that is a very, very hard question. I think that the circumstances of my family, the circumstances of my upbringing were that they place me, they place my psyche, my spirit in that land that is Eastern Kentucky. It's material I come back to again and again and again, even when I think I will move away from it. 2 years ago, I taught in South Dakota and I visited the Badlands, and I've never been so moved by anything. And I think I'm going to write that. But still, I come back again and again to the place where I was raised. Would I be a writer if I were any place else? I mean, I just don't know. I think so. I'm fumbling around with this question. Charles, I'm going to pass it to you. You can fumble around with
I think I would be, but I will say this. I think there's an analogy here to go back to Tolstoy. Tolstoy once said that a novelist's greatest gift was an unhappy childhood. So I think that perhaps a writer's best gift is an unhappy Southern childhood. I think that there's plenty of grist for the mill as far as that particular happenstance might go. Or yeah, a therapist's gift as well. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, they're the same.
I mean, to be frank, I mean, the real truth is that my dad was in the Air Force, and I was born in Topeka, Kansas. I just was going to tell everybody that. We moved back to Kentucky when I was like 6 months old. So, but still, Kansas, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. That was there's another question. Do you mind if I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
That was a good one. I hope we get some more like that. Let's see. Chris asks, who are the Appalachian or regional writers who you most love and who have most influenced you? You guys talked about that a little bit, but do you have particular ones you'd like to mention?
Yeah, I'll mention somebody because I actually think that this person is, if we think of Appalachian writing, I think he's maybe my touchstone, and yet he doesn't get much mention at all anymore. And that's John Ely. I think that
Winter People.
Winter People is
one of my favorite books.
An amazing book.
Yes.
And I thought I would, and I'm actually teaching the Land Breakers in my Appalachian Lit class this spring. And that's the first book we're reading, which I think is a real good way to go into that class. But the Winter People, that bear hunting scene is as good as anything Faulkner wrote. I'm convinced of that. So I think that he's a writer that has really fallen out of favor, or not favor, but he's just not discussed when we think about the big books anymore. But John Ely would always be at the top of my list.
A writer that I love, who I come back to again and again, and she's not done a whole lot, but Marianne Taylor Hall, a novel called Come and Go, Molly Snow, is one that I return to again and again. And I return to it in terms of language, in terms of interior dialogue versus conversing with others, memory. I love her work. I love her work. So she's been a great mentor of mine, and I've been real blessed to get to know her just a little bit.
Thank you, guys. Let's see. I think that was most of the questions. If anyone else has a question, pop it in the chat real quick. We are just about finished. So, did you guys have any thing you wanted to close with particularly?
Could I ask Charles one more question? Would that be the time for that?
If Charles is okay with it, I'm good with it.
Can I ask you one more question? I live on metaphor, like put it on toast in the morning with my coffee. So I just love fire in this book. And there's fire in so many ways. As I was looking at it again this week, there was I was writing down a few of the things, like Emmanuel brush as he paints, the light changes to fire, that beautiful moment. And then there's a more mundane moment with the grill, being lit and this book of matches burning. And then there's the great fire that destroys this land. I'm real interested in that as a writer of images. I mean, do you go back as you revise and you're aware of the movement of fire through the book as much as fire later moves through the land?
Well, I mean, the book was written very much thinking about the wildfires that we had, just about 15 minutes east of where I live. So I was literally living under the shadow of fire as I wrote this book. So it permeated it, certainly.
Beautifully so.
Well, thank you. But yeah, I think that it's important, particularly when you write a book like this, that that you try to unify your imagery, that you try to stick to something, that you're trying to say something, right? I mean, that's the difference between literary fiction and fiction that maybe it is more for entertainment, that you're trying to make a statement about the world in profound terms. And so, yeah, I mean, I think imagery is one way you do that. I think it certainly is the kind of the air you breathe to an extent.
Yes.
So yeah, and just like the book before, it was wilderness was the unifying thing, and what that means in kind of profound terms. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the big, it was, I always say that you write about what bothers you. And I think that's, to me, that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. It can be about things that are essentially just pissing you off, but it can also just be about things that get under your skin that you can't quite understand, because what that means is that you're ultimately striving to understand human mystery. And I think that that's what all good fiction tries to try to root out and understand.
Thank you. And
well,
thank you. Thank you for this novel, which is just so with me. It's going to be with me for a long time, and I hope to teach it someday.
Well, thank you for agreeing to read, and thank you, Jackie, for helping set this up, and Hub City and everybody else that has done such great work. And I'm excited that books are still being talked about, despite the fact that we don't get to see each other. And I certainly look forward to the time where we can do so in person.
Me too.
Thank you both so much for coming on and taking the time to talk with us. That's really wonderful. And do keep in mind that both authors have books out right now and have upcoming books. So we're excited for the next couple of years with them. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you have a good night.
Good night, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Charles and Karen. We really appreciate it.
Good night, everybody.